Welcome to Conversations with Writers. I'm Andy. I'm a writer, and this is an educational YouTube series meant to catalog writing strategies and philosophies through conversations with other writers. Ann Claycomb is the author of 2 fairy tale inflected novels. Her most recent, Silence, published in April 2023, is a MeToo story featuring 4 women who have all been assaulted by their CEO and joined forces to break the fairy tale curses he has put on them to keep them quiet. Anne's first novel, The Mermaid's Daughter, published in 2017, reimagines The Little Mermaid as a dark, multi-generational tale of love, opera, and longing for the sea. An inveterate reader of fairy tales, Anne believes in the power of fairy, chocolate, tequila, and a good workout, in no particular order. She also wishes people would stop using the phrase, fairy tales can come true, as reassurance. Because a great deal of what happens in fairy tales, especially to women, is frankly terrifying. Anne lives with her husband, children, 2 cats, and a mostly hairless dog in Fort Collins, Colorado. And this is my conversation with Anne. Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm hanging in there. So, what are you working on now, and what motivated the project?
So actually, it's funny because the answer has changed since you and I scheduled a talk. So right now, I'm working on, or hoping to get to work on in the next few weeks, a horror fantasy short story about menopause. And and the reason is that I got asked to submit something to a potential anthology with that as the theme from a fellow Titan author. So Titan is the publisher of my most recent book. So yeah, and so another author who's shopping around a horror fantasy collection about menopause has invited me to submit something. So yeah, so that's what I'm working on, and that's why, and it's a completely crazy answer.
And you just released a new book, Silenced, right? Tell me about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, so Silence came out in April in the UK and May in the United States. So, the late spring. And yeah, I've been calling it a Me Too fairy tale retelling, which I think is probably, I honestly wish they'd let me put it in the title, but we didn't get that far. So it's just called Silenced, but I would have had a subtitle that said a Me Too fairy tale. And yeah, it tells the story of 4 women who all work for the same sort of, anonymous, generic, high-powered corporate entity, and sort of discover over the course of the first half of the book that they've all been sexually assaulted by the CEO of the company. And in assaulting them, he's also somehow silenced them in these really strange ways that don't make any sense, but that, we do come to understand are actually, there's actual sort of magical realism in the book, and there's actual magic involved. And so the whole book is them trying to figure out how they find each other and how to break these curses that he's put on them and make him, sort of essentially, be accountable for what he's done.
So, what have you learned about yourself through writing?
I was really thinking about this actually just the other day. One thing is just that which I already knew, that I am very much an introvert, and it affects the writing, and the writing affects the introversion, if that makes sense. So it's very much a feedback loop, if that makes sense. Which, which is to say, I really spend a lot of time noticing things in the world, and then I think I'm more interested sometimes in just noticing things than I am in putting things out there in terms of waving my arms around and making an impact in an everyday conversation. And then when I sit down to write something, I sometimes get overwhelmed actually by how many things I need, how much information I have about what I'm trying to say, and how to strip it away and just convey the thing without spending forever on getting all those details that I've observed. So but I think that's an answer I would have given anytime. I think more recently, especially with this most recent book, I think I'm actually a better person as a writer than I am as a person. Which I'd be so interested to know if other writers feel this way, right? But I think that, I care so much about my characters, and creating characters actually almost, that is what creates empathy in me. not that I'm not already empathetic, I hope that I am, but I think as soon as I've created a character, I immediately start to feel empathy for them and really try work really, really hard to put myself in that spot. And in this most recent book, for example, I've got a diverse cast of women who come from different backgrounds and different identities, and I really found myself just pushing myself way harder in the writing context than I might otherwise have done, like in a workplace conversation or a coffee shop conversation, to have that sense of empathy and advocacy even for my characters. So
What's the role or responsibility of writing for you? What keeps you generating material? Why write?
there's this whole, I think, really terrible thing that's been foisted on us as, and I don't know if it's like women writers or writers of certain generations, or I don't know. I just know there's this sort of cliche of it's from an Ellen Montgomery novel, so not the Anna Green Gables series. You're too young for this, but she had other series. And the one where, Anna Green Gables obviously is a writer, but she gives it up to get married and have 6 children. And her writing is from there on is like she writes funeral poems in the local newspaper. It's literally Anna Green Gables' writing career. But there's another series called Emily of New Moon, and she actually goes on to become a successful author and has some really traumatic things happen around writing, like destroying an entire manuscript. And of course, it's like handwritten manuscript, right? So you can't. Anyway, it's a real sort of like it just like is a roller coaster ride if you're a young aspiring writer. There's a moment in those books early on where someone asks young Emily, "Why do you write?" She says, "I love to write." And they say, "That's not good enough." And she says, "Well, I have to write." And they say, "Great, that's the right answer." And so I think that's awful. And I think it's terrible that I think so many young, as we're young and we say we want to write, like that's the answer we are like steered towards by teachers and mentors and even our family members is, well, if you write because you quote have to write because it's just like a drive in you, then that's great and you should keep writing and that's going to be enough. And so I do not just my dog just entered the room and was a burst of thunder and he's freaking out. So sorry about that. So I really do. I think it's something to reconsider. Like, I mean, I think I consider it all the time right now, especially because there's so many books out there and there are so many people who have something to say. And I think, as we know, more people even who are being allowed to put their voices out there than were ever. I mean, not just in terms of the availability of publishing a book because you can self-publish and you can put it right on Kindle and Kindle Unlimited, but also obviously new voices that people are promoting and people who would never have gotten published even 10, 15 years ago. So I don't think that anyone has, I don't think anyone deserves readers necessarily. And I think that's a thing that I do worry about is I want to make sure that I have something to say that's relevant. So that said, I am telling stories about women's lives. And I do still think every time I try to get away from fairy tales and the fairy tale tropes, even just the most generic kind of fairy tale tropes, like I'm very disturbed, for example, about these whole enemies to lovers fantasy novels where you read them, he really is just abusive, like just like horrifyingly abusive. But somehow we've taken that Beauty and the Beast trope and we've just pulled it as far as we can take it. And so I still think that that's, even as we explore other gender identities and sexualities and women say we're going to break away from fairy tale tropes and they're not going to have a grip on our lives, I think they still do. And they're still just super relevant. And yeah, so I kind of, again, when I got asked to maybe do a thing about menopause and fairy tales, I was like, actually, they didn't ask for fairy tales. They just said, a horror story about menopause. I was like, yeah, and it will be fairy tales. so, I don't, that was a really rambling answer. And I don't know if it answered your question, but I think, you want people to read something because you want to be in a conversation with people. And so I think that's what I'm still hoping to do.
I think that's a wonderful answer. So to me, what I heard is I've got something to say. So it makes sense to write if you've got something to say. And with the Me Too movement, we had more voices coming to the surface that wouldn't otherwise, because that group, that unity gives a sort of protection and power behind it that makes it a little bit easier to share one story.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. I hope that's true.
When you're struggling to write, what do you do to help get yourself back to the page?
I actually had a hard time, obviously, thinking about that question. I had a hard time with that question, not because that's never happened, but because I think at this point that I'm at as a writer is, and I think a lot of writers can, modern, just whatever writers in this moment, this is a new problem, right? Maybe it's not even new, but I don't have the problem right now so much of not having any ideas about what I want to write about. It's more about literally having the time to actually, see the idea through to completion, because I do have a full-time job and I have 3 kids and I have a partner and as I mentioned, a dog who's terrified of thunder. So and so I I think the related problem that I think does maybe answer your question there is struggling with the sense that it's still worth it, right? So you have an idea, and again, I mean, when I was in an MFA program, I had a story due in 2 weeks, so I had to finish. I had to pull something on the page, right? So, but now, there's no one asking. I mean, even this short story that I mentioned at the beginning, I have a year to write this thing. Like, the deadline is next June. So there's no urgency, and there's always that tyranny of the urgent. There's more laundry. There's more to do with work, and there's other people writing. So who needs to hear from you? So I think that the answer to that, though, is how do you get back to the page? Is just remembering that it does just, it's an itch, right? And it's not going to go away. Like, so, and don't not scratch it. Like, just respect the fact that you had an idea and go back to the times when you didn't have any ideas and remember how crappy that felt. So if you've got one, you got to respect it. So I think that's my answer to that question.
What revision strategy or strategies do you find most helpful when revising your own work, and why? What sort of problems or challenges do these activities help you solve?
Yeah, that's really good. I would say I have 2 different strategies. One, which my first readers, I don't there's not many, would tell you. So I'm very much not the messy first draft writer. So that's one, right? Is I am literally revising sentence by sentence. I will write a page, stop. The next day I come back, I read the page over, fully revise. Like, so I'm always refining and refining in as I go. And that didn't used to be true. And I think that's developed. So it does make me very slow, relatively speaking. Um, but it also, I think, helps me. I think just mentally, I can't, I just don't respond well to the messy first draft. It's not something that works for me. I respect it in other people, and I've seen wonderful messy first drafts, and I've been like, I get what happened here, and I know you're gonna bring it back. It's gonna be better. But I think that comes from the second. It's related to the second revision strategy that I would respond to your question with, which is I spend so much writing time not writing, which which is really to say genuinely, it's not procrastinating time. It's really like when you don't have a lot of time to actually write, and yet you want to. First of all, I have learned that once you get edits or criticism or suggestions, it's sort of like not sending that angry letter to your boss or angry letter to your person you want to dump. Like, just sit with it, right? Because it feels awful in the first 10 minutes and then the first maybe 48 hours. um, and I can't tell you how many times I've like gotten an editor critique and I've been like, no way, that's horrible. Forget it. And then like 2 days later, I wake up and I'm like, oh, but what if huh? And, so there's so much time. So sitting with an editor, a comment or a revision, and then again, I just do a lot of time thinking about it before I go back to the page. It's what works for me. And I definitely know that there's people it wouldn't work for, but that seems to be what works is I need to be thinking about the actual ideas that I'm trying to convey and the story rather than, like sentence here, sentence there before yeah. So it's a 2-part answer, but they're really related, right?
That's what I do too. I sit with a piece or an idea for a really long time, and I've pretty much all thought it all out before I
Right.
even put it to the page. So then I
Hmm.
have a kind of roadmap of where I'm going.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
What is your favorite part of the writing process and why?
Um, okay, so my favorite part of the writing process is something that I I want to make sure I like talk about it right because it sounds really like okay, so there are writers who I think are truly like genius and they pull off stuff. And and what I mean by genius and I like what I love is I mean obviously we can talk about the great writers, but I read mostly fantasy and there in fantasy there are opportunities to pull off something that is truly impossible but also has so much emotional weight for the reader and for the characters. And it's that's like my favorite thing in fiction. Lois McMaster Bujold, I know we're going to get to like writers I love. She does it phenomenally. She's brilliant. There's a writer who's from a long time, like from the 70s, 80s, named Julian May, who does it. Obviously, Neil Gaiman has done it, although not in every book. I don't love all of his books, but and a fantasy writer named Guy Gabriel Kay, who again he's also huge. But so, but it's like just this moment that you're trying to create in the reader a sense of watching someone try to do a you know a vault a gymnastics vault. I'm like there's no way they're going to do it there's no so in other words the reader's like I know what you're going to try to do. You're going to try to make me like totally freak out. This is a terrible thing is going to happen and then you're going to have a twist happen and I'm going to buy it and I'm going to be like emotionally satisfied that it happened and I'm not going to throw this book across the room. Right. And I mean, I couldn't explain it any better than that without going like spoilers with different books and stuff like that. So I'm not going to say, I don't know that if I've ever accomplished that. I, I would say there's some, I've gotten some sense from, I did manage to pull it off at the end of the first book, but I've had the feeling of doing it. And even if it's like a little moment, that is the most extraordinary moment where you're like, wait, I actually pulled off this thing that is like my highest pinnacle of reading, and I think I might have pulled it off with the writer. So yeah, that's a super geeky answer, but that is absolutely my answer.
That's a wonderful answer and a brilliant aspiration.
It's a good aspiration for sure. Yeah.
What reading suggestions do you have? What authors do you keep in your back pocket?
So I definitely just listed a bunch of them, but I also was really aware of the fact that I hadn't like when I was thinking about our conversation, like I haven't discovered anyone like a new writer from the last couple of years in high fantasy, which I do. It's not weirdly not what I write, but it is often what I read. But and now I'm gonna blank. There's a book called the Goblin Emperor that's not that old, and it's just a couple of years old. And I thought that was just a beautiful, wonderful book about that explores. And it's a woman, and her name is Kathy, and I can't remember her last name, which is terrible. But it's about a young man who was like the seventh in line to the throne, and he inherits and he becomes the emperor. And it's about all the ways that you know the treacherous court and everything, very much Succession like. But it's so grounded in just his experience and it doesn't try to go out and do this massive world building of like and then the diplomatic problems with this other kingdom and 10 pages on that. It just stays so beautifully focused on him. It was and I was so thrilled at the end to discover that I wanted there to be a sequel and there wasn't. I was so happy because you want a sequel and you're like, oh good, there's a sequel, and then there's 12 more sequels and then you just it's exhausting. And I don't know, I must be exhausting for the writer as well. So but I mean, I do think Lois McMaster Bujold, I don't know that she's writing anymore. She's largely known for her sci-fi, but her fantasy work is absolutely brilliant. Her sci-fi is really good too, but I just am not drawn to sci-fi usually. And I will give a shout out to one of the books that I absolutely come back to, and it's not her only book, but her name is Emma Bull, and this book is from the 80s. I think it's in the late 80s, early 90s. She's written other books, and then she became part of a kind of collective, a group of people who were writing a whole really weird and interesting series. But her book it's called War for the Oaks, and it's just a one-off book about a rock band in the Twin Cities that gets trapped in a fairy war, but it's so perfectly plotted. If I was teaching fantasy writing, in a class, I would absolutely, there'd be a whole spectrum, but I would make people read this book if it was like people who wanted to write fantasy novels, because it's so perfectly plotted and perfectly scaled. Never gets she never loses control of the narrative and suddenly you've got too many characters, or and you always know what's at stake. And she also writes really brilliantly about music. And I certainly, my first novel, I was trying really, really hard to write about music, and it's so hard. I just find it really, really hard. I think it's so much easier to write about something that you taste, or obviously that you see or smell. I find writing about something you hear to be just really challenging. So, and yeah, I mean, I don't only read fantasy. I did some master's work on Willa Cather. She's problematic in some ways. I will not speak for her attitudes towards people of color out in the American West, for sure. It does not age well. But the sentence level prose that she crafted is, and she wrote about art and people just wanting to be artists, and I've always found that really beautiful. So
Thank you so much for those reading suggestions. I can't wait to check them out. And thank
good.
you for making time for the interview. I really appreciate it. And I learned so much.
Good. It was so fun. I mean, writers always love the chance to talk about writing, Andy. So thanks for the opportunity.